that people of color and poor people usually score worse. So the whole blueprint that they created 100 years ago is still having the same effect today. Hi, I'm Adri Cortee and welcome back to my YouTube channel. I'm a fourth year PhD student at Vanderbilt University. On this channel, I post videos about different academic topics. I interview people with unique experiences in academia. My goal for this channel is to make academia accessible and entertaining. So if you like what you hear, please make sure to subscribe and hit that little bell so you always get notifications every time that I post. So in today's video, I'm going to be talking about the GRE. I'm going to be going into exactly what the GRE is, what is it used for, a short history of standardized testing, some firsthand accounts from people who had sort of rough experiences with the GRE, if the GRE actually predicts what it's supposed to predict, and if it doesn't, then what are some alternatives to the GRE? Okay, so let's get into it. So what is the GRE? So it's a standardized test that admissions committees at universities can use as a part of other measurements to see if a grad student should be accepted into that PhD program. So what admission committees should be doing is trying to find students who they think will advance the research in whatever field they're going to be entering, that are going to finish their PhD and are going to go on to have careers in that field. That's like 5 to 10 years of someone's life that these committees basically need to try to predict to see who gets into graduate programs and who doesn't. And so there's some different measures that these committees can use to determine who's going to be the best graduate student. So one of them is your grade point average, your GPA from your undergrad. Another one is a letters of recommendation from different professors or people from your undergrad or different parts of your life that can tell them that you are the right fit for their program and that you're going to be successful, and talk about your past successes and things like that. And there's also a personal statement that you write about why you're right for the program, why they should want you. And then there is the GRE aspect. So the GRE stands for the Graduate Record Examination. And it has three main parts of the test, which is quantitative, which is like the math part. There's a verbal part where it's like vocab and reading comprehension. And then there's like an analytical writing part where you have a prompt and you write an essay. And so this is, again, a standardized test. And it's created and administered by Educational Testing Service, or ETS. ETS basically says that it's supposed to measure overall academic readiness for graduate school. And so ETS actually recommends that admission committees should not be using cutoff scores for the GRE. So that means if a high score on a GRE is like 700, then admission committees should not be throwing out all the applications from students who have a 600 or a 500. The ETS, the people who administer this test, actually recommend against that. But some admission committees will do that, and it's actually an inappropriate way to rank people. Okay, so let's get into more about the GRE. It takes about $200 to take the test, and that's only if you take it once. So if you fail and need to take it multiple times, it's about $200 each time you have to do it. And then you also have to pay ETS to send your scores to universities, which is honestly crazy to me. I probably should do a whole video on the barriers of entering grad school, one of them being financial, but we'll get into that later. The test itself is about 3 hours and 45 minutes, which is a giant chunk of time. And so as we can see, it takes a lot of time to take the actual test. It costs a good amount of money to take the test. If you're gonna buy prep books or take prep classes, I've heard that prep classes can cost as much as $3,000. I know the prep books are probably around $40 to $60. So already it really starts to add up taking the GRE. Okay, so far what we've learned is that the GRE is a standardized test. It can be used by admission committees as a part of determining if students get into graduate school. People who distribute this test have to warn against cutoff scores because they know that ranking people is an easy method to get a lot of candidates out at once, but also can be an extremely biased method. And so speaking of biases, let's get into the history of standardized testing. So I'm going to go into a short history of standardized testing. This is not at all comprehensive, but these are just a few key points to kind of set the stage for what exactly standardized testing is. So standardized testing basically started with the IQ test, or the intelligence quotient test, that Alfred Binet, this French psychologist, made in I think the early 1900s, 1920s, something like that. And he basically created this test for small children as a way to determine if there was any developmental issues as they grew up. And so then in 1927, these white American men, psychologists, such as Lewis Terman and Carl Brigham, brought this IQ test to America to use it in different ways than it was intended. Lewis Terman, so he adapted the IQ test into what he called the Stanford-Binet Intelligence Test, and this was sort of the beginning of standardized tests for public schools. So during this time, it was when kids were transitioning from weirdly working in factories in a super unethical and dangerous way into going into school systems, and this was the sort of like mass public schools. And so they were basically looking for ways to sort students in a cheap and quick way, and standardized tests were definitely the way to do it. Based on the Stanford-Binet Intelligence Test, there were 4 different categories that you could go into. One was feeble-minded, there was dull, there was average, and there was superior. And so basically Lewis Terman, the guy who was doing all of this, believed that feeble-mindedness was very common for Spanish Indians and Black people. And the language he uses too is so obviously trying to create like this system where somebody's going to be on the top and someone's going to be on the bottom, because maybe the rankings could be like competent, needs work, like something like that, instead of literally feeble-minded and superior. Like, we all know that this was designed this way. This was not an accident. Lewis Terman thought that children who were in like the lower category should be put into separate classrooms, and he said they cannot master abstractions, but they can be made into efficient workers. Ugh. It even feels gross coming out of my mouth. Like, we all know that is so racist, like, oh my God. And this is the beginning of standardized tests. Like, this is how it was born. That's Lewis Terman. Another guy was Carl Brigham. And so first I'll tell you his quote, and then I'll tell you his connection to standardized testing. So Carl Brigham says, American Negroes, the Italians, and the Jews are genetically ineducable. They can't be like educated. It would be a waste even to attempt to give these born morons and imbeciles a good Anglo-Saxon education. Oof. He said that in 1923, and then in 1926, he was hired by the College Board to create the SAT. Okay, so this man who's incredibly, openly, proudly racist creates the SAT. Another standardized test that decides who goes to college and who doesn't. And so both Lewis Terman and Carl Brigham were both firm believers in eugenics. And so this is the study of basically how to arrange reproduction within a human population to increase the occurrence of heritable characteristics that are considered desirable. Okay, that sort of raises a lot of questions. Who's deciding what's desirable, and then who is stopping people that they believe do not have desirable traits from breeding? Like, just the definition itself raises so many questions about what the hell. This is just a way to be incredibly racist and hateful and violent against certain groups of people in the name of science. It's not scientific, it's racially biased, but it's also, the Nazis loved eugenics, and they basically, it was their doctrine that they could use to justify doing unspeakable things to these minority groups, including Jews and Black people. The guys who helped create standardized testing were firm believers in eugenics. And so I watched this video, and people were saying, you know, it's 100 years ago this happened, but that the results that these racist asshole guys wanted from their standardized test still lives today 100 years from when they first implemented this. And so you can look now at data and find that people of color and poor people usually score worse versus white people or people who are affluent. So the whole blueprint that they created 100 years ago is still having the same effect today. And so you create all these barriers. If you have a racist standardized test that acts as a barrier to college, then people who cannot go to college, end up making less money. You're creating all these different barriers, gaps in wealth. You can just see how hurtful these sorts of things can be, especially for school children. There's been a lot of people fighting against standardized testing, civil rights activists. There's a lot of parents now too that are part of these groups that are opt-out groups that opt their children out from standardized testing, because we're finding out more and more over years and years with data that it just kind of creates barriers to success for a lot of people, and it's not a great measure for actual intelligence or creativity or critical thinking or all these things that are actually important in a well-rounded student. So there's a lot of pushback against standardized testing. The GRE was introduced in 1949, and we know it's a standardized test. And so now the question is, does it have the same characteristics of other standardized tests of creating unnecessary, inaccurate ways to test people, to keep in certain people and keep out others? So let's find out. Family socioeconomic status, it can be really well correlated with people's GRE scores. So more you're predicting if the person is rich or poor rather than if they are prepared for graduate school or not. And so according to even the Education Testing Service, the ETS, which administers the GRE, they say that women score 80 points lower on average in the physical science versus men, and that African Americans score 200 points below white people, and that GRE is a better indicator of sex and skin color than ability. Okay, this is the ETS. This is the company that administers the GRE that is finding these findings. That's like cigarette companies publishing data about cigarettes causing cancer. You're like, wow, even you know it's messed up, and you keep doing it. It's just crazy to me. And this restricts the flow of women and minorities into science, obviously. And so I read this one article going into, well, why do we even see this? Why is there this like very prominent distinction between averages for white men versus people of color and women? And so one reason was the student access to academic prep. And so what I talked about before a little bit was that preparatory classes can be up to $3,000. Prep books, I think the one that I bought was like $55. I also bought these like GRE flashcards so I could take them around and like study vocabulary. I think that costs like $40. They also go into that stereotype threat can be an issue. And I saw this one study. We basically had these different groups of people, and in one cohort of students, the GRE-like test was said to be a diagnostic test of intellectual ability. And then that group, low socioeconomic participants, perform worse than the higher socioeconomic participants. But when they basically presented the test as it's non-diagnostic of intellectual ability, the people with lower socioeconomic status scored just as high as the other group of higher socioeconomic status. So it's also this emotional response to having your intelligence tested by this one test in this stressful environment and calling it a diagnostic test of your intelligence. This can create a feeling of stereotype threat in people of color and minorities, and this could affect their scores on these tests. And also one reason was an inability to actually pay to retake the test. I read this one article called "I Bombed the GRE, but I'm Thriving as a PhD Student," which was actually published 2 months ago by this graduate student named Natalie Aristobal. And so her dream was to get a PhD. So basically her history is that she did research in undergrad. She was in this program that helps undergrads get ready for doctoral studies. Basically she can't take a prep course because it's $3,000. All she can buy is this test prep book that's $40. She's a native Spanish speaker, so remember the GRE is in English, and so she did very badly the first time she took the GRE. She also talks about a test format where correct answers are followed by harder questions in the GRE. And so when you're answering and you start to get easier questions, it's kind of like a psychological thing where you're like, am I answering all of these wrong? Why are the questions getting easier? So you can kind of start to doubt yourself, and that can obviously make you do worse when you're not in a great like psychological state. And so basically she took time off after she bombed it the first time to study some more, and she ended up working in these labs and getting into a master's program based on her experience. And she got got a first author publication in this master's program. She's doing really well actually doing science, which should be the measure of how well you can do science. So she basically, after all of that, takes the GRE again. She pays another $200 to take it, and she scored lower than the first time she took it. So basically, she has to talk to this professor that she knows and has kind of been in contact with, and he advocates for her getting into the PhD program despite her low GRE grades. She wonders, where she would be now if the admission committee had not kind of overlooked her low GRE scores and paid more attention to actually her experience, her competence as like a actual working scientist. We've talked about now the barriers that the GRE can put in front of women and people of color. This is one of the reasons there could be underrepresented minorities and women within science. We've talked about how the GRE can actually predict your socioeconomic status. The biggest question becomes, can the GRE actually predict success in graduate school? We're going to go over this paper from actually Vanderbilt about the GRE's ability to actually predict people's success in graduate school. They basically looked at students in this umbrella program called IGP, or the Interdisciplinary Graduate Program. It started in 1992. It has all of these different departments that are under it, like biochemistry, cancer biology, cell biology. And so the IGP admissions committee meets weekly during late winter to make admissions decisions. And it's made up of 13 faculty and a representative diversity initiative faculty. They look at several things, one of them being GRE, like we've been talking about, the quantitative, verbal, and writing scores. They don't use it as a cutoff, and they also have, again, the undergraduate GPA, letter of recommendation, personal statement. Some of them will get interviews and you actually come to the campus. And so again, there's no GRE cutoff score, but if the applicant's GRE scores are really low, then they'll have to excel at one of the other application requirements. So they kind of have to make up for their low GRE score. And so for this study, the data was collected from 683 students who matriculated through the IGP program from 2003 to 2011. So at the time they did this study, over 80% of the students had time to complete the program. They want to find out if GRE scores can predict several things: graduating with a PhD, passing the qual exam, time to your PhD defense, the number of presentations at national or international meetings, the number of first author peer-reviewed papers at the time that you defend, obtaining a grant or a fellowship, performance in the first semester coursework, the cumulative graduate GPA, the final assessment of the competence of the student as a scientist that is evaluated by their PI or their research mentor. These are all the things they're looking into. They're going to try to see if any of those things correlate with the person's GRE scores. They need to figure out the independent contributions of the GRE. So they also have several controls for each person, which is the undergrad GPA, where they went to college in their undergrad, whether the person had a prior advanced degree, like if they have a master's or not already, if they're an underrepresented person, if they're a national student, and what their gender is. So these are all things that they have to take into account to use as controls, so that they're just looking at the contribution of the GRE onto all of these things. And so here I want to show you, if you're not familiar with what a perfect positive correlation looks like and what a perfect negative correlation looks like. So now we see what this looks like. So let's see what their data looks like. And so on the y-axis, this first one is time to defense in years and the GRE quantitative score. You can see it's just a straight line through. You can see this is not correlating with time to defense. This one is presentation count. So how many times you present at international or national meetings. Again, there's no really correlation here between your GRE quantitative score and how many times you present in your grad school career. And then this last one, first author publication count and the GRE quantitative score. First of all, I'm shook that some of these grad students had 6 publications. The y-axis is 0 to 6. Okay. Oh, 6? Comment down below if you've ever heard of anyone getting 6 first author publications in their graduate school career. Like, that is crazy. I'm praying for one. Whatever. The takeaway point is that there does not seem to be a correlation at all between GRE quantitative score and first author publication count. So all of these important things that are considered ways to be successful in graduate school seem to not really correlate with the GRE quantitative score. Here's another graph, and on the y-axis they have the standardized regression coefficient. And so you can just think of this as like how correlated that the thing is to what's on the x-axis. Black is the GRE quantitative score, gray is the GRE verbal score, and then the darker gray is the GRE writing. And what you can see from all the things they're looking at, the only thing that really correlates to these GRE scores is the first semester grade and the graduate GPA. So it seems like what they're finding in this study is that the GRE scores do not correlate with most measures of success in grad school, such as passing a qualifying exam, getting first author publications, presenting, all of these things, but it does seem to correlate with classroom work. So just how good your grades are could be due to measuring characteristics such as test taking skills, attention, time management, stress management, and just test question comprehension. As you would suspect, what the GRE is predicting is how well someone can take a test. Let's just think for a second about in a job interview, in the real world, when someone's figuring out, are you the best person for this job? Do they ever ask you, like, are you really good at taking tests? No one asks you that. They ask about time management, creativity, working in teams, how you work under stress, how you overcome adversity. No job interview ever asks you, how well do you take tests? It's just so silly that what we're finding out from this data is that the GRE is just basically measuring how good are you at taking tests. Who cares about that? Like, doesn't really show someone's actual intelligence. And it definitely, we're seeing the GRE does not correlate with success in graduate school. And so what they're saying is the test taking skill will just overlap with taking tests in grad school because obviously it's the same thing, but it's different from critical thinking. It's different from designing experiments, different from writing skills. It's different from taking a qualifying exam, which is not just taking a normal test. It requires communication skills. It requires defending argument with evidence. Like, these are the things that make a good graduate student. That can't really be measured via taking a test, especially taking a standardized test. And so they conclude that the GRE is more closely aligned with classroom behavior than laboratory performance. And so if we think back to the things that the admission committee is looking at, they're already looking at your undergraduate GPA. So they're sort of getting how well you take tests, how well you can study. So really, if the GRE is just measuring the same thing, then why did we pay $200 to take it and stress out and have to sit in this stuffy room for 4 hours and maybe take it again and all of these things and be like emotionally stressed when it's just basically telling us the same thing that someone's GPA is telling us? That makes no sense. So they say, thus, to the question of whether GRE scores can help guide us to select individuals with these research-specific skills, the answer is that they do not. And they talk about this study that actually shows that letters of recommendation can actually predict the amount of first author publications that someone has, which actually makes sense. Why is the GRE misused like this? They go into an idea that admissions committees are just busy. There's a lot of students applying, they're busy, they're probably faculty that have other things to do. This is not probably their only responsibility is to be on the admissions committee. And so it's just easy to rank people via their GRE score. Like, if you can literally put the people in an Excel sheet and rank them, you know, from highest score to lowest score, get rid of the lowest scores. You've already gotten rid of a bunch of people, and then the amount of people you actually have to look into their application gets a lot smaller. We can see how that could be easy and tempting for someone who's really busy. But as scientists, as people in academia and higher education, we have to care about data. Even if it goes against things that are easy, we have to care about it. And it's showing us that GRE does not have predictive value in success for graduate school. So it cannot and should not be used as a way to cut out a bunch of applicants easily. Besides what I've said, why should the graduate admission committee really care about fixing this problem if it just makes their life easier? This article I read talks about how diversity in the form of individuals with different perspectives and backgrounds and experiences is a key component of innovation and problem solving. I mean, that is just so true. When you have a homogenous group of people trying to solve a problem, you don't get all of those unique ideas that might be outside of the box of something that they would think about. Less diversity in STEM graduate programs means slower progress in tackling scientific problems and challenges. You want a more diverse group because that just is better teamwork. There's more ideas. It feels weird to like go into an argument of like why we should be promoting diversity. Like, of course we should be. It feels even like silly to go into an argument of why, like, yes, of course, just equal opportunity for people, like, just make it fair. If all other arguments like why we need diversity don't really hit home for you, it's unfair. We just need to make this process more fair. That's what it comes down to. And also they talk about how PhD completion rate in the US in STEM graduate programs is 50%. 50% of people who enter the graduate program and like get accepted from these measurements don't continue. So obviously there is something wrong with the way the success is being predicted by these application measurements. Like also it's probably because of the toxic academia and things like that and the tiny amount of pay and whatever. It's not all bad, but there's probably other reasons. But obviously 50% completion rate is not good. And this could be one of the reasons that you're filtering out people that would be successful because of the dumb like GRE score. We now know that GRE doesn't have a lot of predictive power for doing well in graduate school. And so now what should universities do about this? Like what is the next step? The people who published this paper about the Vanderbilt IGP program say you should not be using the GRE test scores as a sole arbiter of admissions to graduate programs. And they say that standardized tests are unlikely to provide the important information needed to determine success in grad school. They say importantly, given the racial and socioeconomic differences in test performance, a strong reliance on GRE scores for admissions may negatively impact specific groups of students and can reduce the diversity of students in a program. The limited benefits of the GRE do not outweigh the potential cost of excluding minority and low socioeconomic status applicants. Okay, we know that GRE is bad now. Hopefully I've convinced you. But then should something else be used? What should we do? What's an alternative to this? So this is sort of for younger people, but it's called the New York Performance Standards Consortium. And they basically have this new testing system to replace standardized testing. And it's based on in-depth literacy, mathematical problem solving, application of the scientific method, a span of mediums for exhibiting learning, and a chance for students to have a voice and proud ownership of their work. Just comment down below like all the standardized tests you've taken in your life and what you got from them. Like one positive thing you got from taking a standardized test. You start taking standardized tests like in the 3rd grade, but before that they have to train you on how to bubble in a Scantron because it takes like dexterity skills that like little kids probably don't have. They're literally wasting time in school to teach you how to bubble in a Scantron so you can take standardized tests. And then also it just makes a whole curriculum for teaching. They're teaching you to pass the standardized tests because it's also used in this weird way to measure teachers' success, which should not be used for. And so instead of learning all the things that make someone creative and think critically and communicate really well, they're just teaching you how to basically pass a standardized test. And we all know standardized tests are basically just trying to like memorize little facts and do it quickly and under stress. But really, what is that really getting you ready for in real life? Like if you do really well on a standardized test, does that mean you're a good communicator? Does that mean you have really good critical thinking skills? Does that mean you're artistic or musical? I mean, it's just weird to test individuals with this like mass test given out to everybody and then say it means this about this individual, but it can't measure individuality because you gave the same test to everybody. And so now back to PhD, there are these innovative PhD programs. In these new programs, the completion rate is above 80%. And we know that's way above the average of 50%. It's also boosts participation by women and minorities. So the admission process is an interview that examines like college and research experience, but it also looks into leadership experience, the service to your community, your life goals, like what you want. And they're trying to just assess like people's maturity, their perseverance, their adaptability to new environments, and their conscientiousness, which is really interesting because in the graduate school interview process, and I'll probably make a video about this, just the whole process, how to get into grad school and things like that. I didn't get any questions about conscientiousness, about actually my values or anything like that. So I think that's an interesting thing to be a part of an interview process. This is this new way that they're doing this without the GRE. What's the outcome of this? So the people who have participated in it, at this point, I think this article was from 2014, so they're talking about this cohort, but it was about 67 students, 56 who were underrepresented and 35 that were women, and 81% of them have earned or made progress toward their PhD when this article was written. All of them who have completed it were employed in STEM workforce, were faculty members at universities, they were staff scientists in industry, and the really kind of amazing thing about this, so I just told you all of the things that these people are doing that finish their PhD in this program. 85% of the people in the program would have been eliminated from consideration for PhD programs due to the GRE quantitative cutoff score of 700. Like, that's crazy. These people that are out here faculty members working in industry labs, like doing these really cool, important jobs, like doing awesome science, would have not even had a chance to get close to that because they had a quantitative score on the GRE less than 700, which we know does not predict success in grad school or science careers. And they also talk about the FIS Vanderbilt program. Drawback is that it takes a lot of time to interview people. Like each person has a 30-minute interview. So the application process is a lot longer and probably takes more time and money. But I think the outcome shows that that is worth it. They also talk about how ETS is marketing a tool to try to evaluate applicants' personal attributes rather than the GRE. Just in the articles I got, I don't know, it felt like ETS like distributes the GRE, but is also always being like, but don't use it as a cutoff score. And we're trying to make something different because you shouldn't probably use it. Like they're aware of how ineffective it is, but they're like still distributing it. It seems weird to me. In the article talking about the FIS Vanderbilt program, they say, this is not a call to admit unqualified students in the name of social good. This is a call to acknowledge that the typical weight given to GRE scores in admissions is disproportionate. So I think all of that we've talked about today, that's kind of the take-home message. So does anyone care about this? There's a lot of data out there showing the GRE scores do not correlate with first author publications or technical ability in the lab or creativity in the lab. It just doesn't correlate. Do any of these programs give a shit about this? And thankfully, yes, they do. This guy on Twitter named Joshua Hall, he has this like Google sheet of all the biomedical graduate programs that do not require the GRE. And so guess how many of the graduate programs do not require the GRE? 402. Like that's amazing. Programs at Yale, programs at University of California, Berkeley, programs at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, programs at Emory, programs at Vanderbilt, like all of these different programs at these different schools are listening to the data. If you're looking into a graduate school that still requires the GRE, you might want to think twice. That might be a red flag for that university if they're still using the GRE as part of the admissions process. I'm anti-GRE, if that's not clear. My scores were included in my admissions process. The year after me, that was no longer a thing. So Vanderbilt got rid of that, which is great. Hopefully this video was interesting. Comment down below your experience with standardized testing, how you feel about the GRE. If you know of any sort of alternatives also, that you can link some different resources about alternatives to the GRE, alternatives to standardized testing that can predict someone's intelligence, someone's success, someone's creative thinking. That's it for today. Please make sure to subscribe, hit the little bell so you always get notifications every time I post, and I will see you guys in the next video.